Roger B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, June 18th, 2020. For the second time this week, the Republican-dominated Supreme Court has dealt a setback to Donald Trump, this time over the Dreamers. Now, as you may recall, going back to the fall of 2017, Trump was desperate to get, to get funding for his wall and to force issues through the Congress to drastically reduce legal immigration under the guise of fighting illegal immigration. And one of the things he did with flourish and feigned regret was issue an executive order to rescind Obama's executive order that created DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And this affected 700,000 young immigrants who are called Dreamers. And Trump did this with an extended fuse, right? He said this will go into effect in 6 months, or I think that was the term. And he was trying to hold the Dreamers hostage to force Congress to take action on his terms. But as usual, the Republicans made sure that there was no action taken because they benefit politically from having the immigration issues unresolved. They are determined to keep it that way. And so it was Chief Justice John Roberts who joined the 4 so-called liberals on the court. And this is a very technical ruling. It's not nearly as sweeping or as much of a landmark decision as the one on workplace rights for gays, lesbians, and transgenders that was issued earlier this week. So what the court did was say, we don't take a position on whether the president should rescind DACA and whether it is a sound policy. Quoting from the majority opinion, we address only whether the Department of Homeland Security complied with the procedural requirement that it provide a reasoned explanation for its action. The agency failed to consider the conspicuous issues of whether to retain forbearance and what, if anything, to do about the hardship to DACA recipients. That dual failure raises doubts about whether the agency appreciated the scope of its discretion or exercised that discretion in a reasonable manner. And if we reduce this to more or less plain English, the court found that they wanted to give the boot to Trump's action, but not in a way that really set a precedent or that barred him from doing this properly and still ending the protection for the Dreamers. And Clarence Thomas, in a dissent, wrote, "Today's decision must be recognized for what it is, an effort to avoid a politically controversial but legally correct decision. The court could have made clear that the solution respondents seek must come from the legislative branch. In doing so," he said, "it has given the green light for future political battles to be fought in this court rather than where they rightfully belong, in the political branches." Now, I'm loath to praise Clarence Thomas, but he has a point. And the point is that Congress and the president can't agree. He took this action, which certainly damages the interests of an identifiable group of people. And then they tried to leave it up to the Supreme Court, essentially to endorse the executive action. And so this has led to a predictable tweet storm from our dear tweeter. He said that and this is a pretty ugly phrase, the twin decisions, this one and the one on sexual issues in the workplace, he called the decision shotgun blasts into the face of conservatives. Really? And then as ever, making it all about him and his sense of victimization. He asked why the Supreme Court doesn't like him. Holy shit. All right, here's one tweet. These horrible and politically charged decisions coming out of the Supreme Court are shotgun blasts into the face of people that are proud to call themselves Republicans or conservatives. We need more justices or we will lose our Second Amendment and everything else. Everything else. Vote Trump 2020. So he inevitably makes it about himself. He politicizes it. And in a second tweet, he asks the question, do you get the impression that the Supreme Court doesn't like me? Well, they've only paved the way for his ugly Muslim ban. They said it was okay to divert funds from other budgets to pay for the wall under a phony declaration of emergency. They have deferred to Trump more often than not. But he, of course, is wounded, victimized, and using it to try to energize his base. That's about all he knows how to do. Oh, there's another tweet that came out later today. The DACA decision he called a highly political one, seemingly not based on the law. If the radical left Democrats assume power, your Second Amendment, right to life, secure borders, and religious liberty, among many other things, are over and gone. Find me a radical left Democrat, will you? Certainly not one who's running for president this year. So new polling shows that there is erosion of support for Trump by Republicans, but it's not huge. And the real soft spot in his support going into the November election is with independents. So predictably, only 9% of Democratic registered voters, but 18% of independent registered voters believe the country is headed in the right direction, while just fewer than half of Republicans say the same thing. Now, this is a polling question that always gets asked, and it's the broad measure of whether people feel good about what's going on or not. So 4 in 5 Republican registered voters, 81%, approve of his handling of the presidency, while 9% of Democrats and 29% of independents offer that, agree with that statement. Independent registered voters are nearly twice as likely to say they would vote for Biden. That's 39% compared to Trump, 21%, if the election were held today. 4 in 5 Democratic registered voters, that's 84%, report they would vote for Biden, which suggests that the Bernie people are falling into line or they just didn't get called by this pollster. Yet this concerns with immigration have plummeted over the last year among Republicans, with only 9% reporting immigration as the most important issue, compared with 37% at this very time last year. So that is interesting as he kind of doubles down and tries to play the race and immigrant card hard. His voters appear to have moved on. So in another one of these Inside the White House articles, and this is not the John Bolton book, we'll get to that much later in the podcast, New York Times reporters with a headline, Does Trump want to fight for a second term? His self-sabotage worries aides. And when some of his advisors criticized him, or at least tried to, about his tweet, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, he said, well, I have to be myself. And ignoring them, a few hours later, he posted on Twitter a letter from his former personal lawyer describing some of the protesters as terrorists. And unnamed insiders say his repeated acts of political self-sabotage, like the widely denounced photo op at a church for which peaceful protesters were forcibly removed, a threat to use the American military to quell protests, These have significantly damaged his re-election prospects, and yet he appears unable or unwilling to curtail them. The people interviewed said the president is acting trapped and defensive. His self-destructive behavior has been so out of step for an incumbent in an election year that many advisors wonder if he's really interested in serving a second term. So the article says they interviewed more than a dozen people who interact with the president frequently. They described Trump as wallowing in self-pity about news coverage since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. And it's interesting, Rush Limbaugh this morning was holding a pity party for Trump and saying that the whole coronavirus pandemic was devised and deployed in order to ruin the country and help defeat Trump. And I tell you, I hear from a lot of people who are critical of the response to the pandemic. They think masks are bad. They think that the stay-at-home order was bad. They think that this is highly exaggerated. But this idea that it was ginned up for political purposes in order to, desperately defeat this man, well, you need you need some special meds to get there. One of the few people named in this article is the Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci, who served 11 days as White House Communications Director. Quote, he is the modern LBJ where everything has gone wrong and none of his skill sets are effective. It's at what's gone wrong. Noting that nothing that Trump has tried so far, Mooch said, has changed the narrative about his presidency or shoved broader concerns about racism and spread of the virus aside in news coverage. That's why I know he doesn't like the job, said Scaramucci. And in the one situation where Trump appeared to listen to his advisors, when he yielded and shifted the date of his mob rally from Juneteenth to the day after in Tulsa, well, he didn't tell anybody about it. They have to follow him on Twitter. And that's how insiders learned. And Mark Meadows, the number 4 White House chief of staff in this administration, is said to have complained that he had no idea how fractious and unwieldy the climate was until he got there. Come on. It's obvious to everybody. But Mark Meadows, Mr. Freedom Caucus, he had no idea? That's just silly. Well, yesterday afternoon, after our podcast deadline, the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, that's Atlanta, Paul Howard, announced 11 charges against the former police officer for the department, Garrett Rolfe, and 3 charges against his co-officer, Devin Brosman. And it was Rolfe who fired the shots that killed Rayshard Brooks in the Wendy's parking lot. Now, there is a report that the second officer, Brosnan, agreed to appear as a state witness, but his lawyers say that that is not accurate. We learned additional details that after Brooks was shot and lying bleeding on the ground, the shooter, Officer Rolfe, kicked him, and the other guy, Brosnan, stood on his shoulders. And they waited at least 2+ minutes to even check his pulse or do rudimentary medical checks as he lay bleeding to death in the Wendy's parking lot. So Trump, of course, Mr. Law and Order, Richard Nixon 2.0, he has defended the cop who shot Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta as the blue flu, no relation to the coronavirus, settled in Atlanta. First to Trump's tweets. Actually, this was a statement given to Fox News, the Fair and Balanced channel. Oh, he told his pal, Sean Hannity, you can't resist a police officer, and if you have a disagreement, you have to take it up after the fact. It was out of control. The whole situation was out of control. It's up to justice now. It's going to be up to justice, whatever that means. I hope he, Rolfe, the officer, gets a fair shake, because police have not been treated fairly in our country. But again, you can't resist a police officer like that. So he has no interest in the details and whether this was a justifiable use of deadly force. And a lot of Atlanta cops, starting on the third shift last night, have been making themselves unavailable, calling in sick. We don't have numbers on that, but that's called the blue flu. And the police union said, well, we've been notified by officers that that's what they're doing, but this is not a coordinated effort, which, of course, I don't believe. In Portland last night, there was an effort to set up a Chaz South. As protesters took over part of the Pearl District, they barricaded several streets with dumpsters, wooden pallets, trash cans, and declared the area the Patrick Kimmons Autonomous Zone, after a black man who was killed by Portland cops in 2018. By morning, the group had dwindled to about 50 people, and at 5:30 this morning, the police cleared the area. Two more cities have shifted funds. Philadelphia, the mayor and the city council reached an agreement yesterday to reduce funding for the police by $33 million. And the aforementioned Portland, Oregon, voted to adopt a budget that cuts $27 million from the police. They were looking for $50 million, but the $27 million figure is what they ended up with in the final budget vote there last night. In Louisville, Kentucky, this past Monday, a 23-year-old Latino security guard who was patrolling the Hall of Justice was shot at when he began filming a swarm of riot police tackling a man to the ground during a protest. His video shows smoke, a bang, and then a mark on the window that he was aiming his camera phone through. Oh, shit, he says, they shot at me. He asked for anonymity because he wants to keep his job. But he believes a police officer shot at him. It had to be an officer, he said. It was pretty eye-opening seeing how, in my opinion, how trigger-happy they are. And he said politically he's pretty neutral, but when he saw the scrum with the cops manhandling the protester, he decided to roll his camera. Yesterday, the half-brother of the African-American man whose body was found hanging by a rope in the city of Palmdale in North Los Angeles County. Well, the brother, identified as Teron Boone, was pulled over by police. They were tracking a man wanted for kidnapping, spousal assault, and assault with a deadly weapon. Now, we haven't seen any video on this. We're taking the officer's account here. When investigators tried to stop his car, they said the man opened the door and began shooting. And so deputies shot and killed the man, and that's another case that we'll have to see fully investigated. The other day I mentioned that the top 3 police unions in California, San Francisco, San Jose, and Los Angeles took out full-page newspaper ads to pledge their support for police reforms. And I told you how skeptical I am about this. Well, in today's San Francisco Chronicle on the front page, police unions push to roll back reforms. The unions have pumped $2 million into a November ballot measure that would partially overturn laws that are considered models for reforming the criminal justice system. A total of $4 million has been raised to gather signatures and qualify the Reducing Crime and Keeping California Safe Act campaign. And it basically tinkers with previously passed ballot measures like Prop 47 that raised the threshold for felony theft from $450 to $950. They want to roll it back even further to $250. So that would fill up jails and prisons. It would turn misdemeanors into felonies that lead to basically sinking people deeper into the carceral state. And it is a real retrograde piece of initiative. And it shows that my skepticism was well warranted. You cannot trust the police unions. Maybe you remember, if you listen to every podcast interview that I release, my conversation at the end of March this year with Tony Platt, the radical criminologist, and the author of a book. I'm sorry, I don't have the title in front of me. Anyway, he wrote a blog post and brought it to my attention. A couple of quotes. The movement to defund the police in the United States should be taken seriously. It urges us to try something that's never been tried on a national scale, question the assumptions of a policing Goliath that requires almost 5 times as many employees as the nation's social workers, and imagine a society without systemic inequality and injustice that doesn't need a policing, guarding, and security force of at least 4.3 million. And he says, really, before we can intelligently reduce funding for police, we need to know how much is being spent. He said the Federal Bureau of Justice statistics used to be a barely adequate source of up-to-date information, but it's no longer even that since Trump took over and drastically cut its funding, politicizing its leadership. To figure out what policing costs requires demystifying streams of national funding and tracking intragovernmental transfers of equipment, weapons, and technology. He goes on to say, to Lyndon Johnson, the police were frontline soldiers in the war on crime. To Nixon, he elevated law and order into a national ideological slogan, rallied his base to turn back the wave of crime. Under Ronald Reagan, the FBI's budget almost doubled. By the time Bill Clinton became president in '93, the New Democrats had also taken the low road to demagoguery and passed legislation that funded 100,000 more police and slashed welfare programs. And he argues that private security workers must be included in the count and cost. They outnumber public police by more than 25% and perform most of the same functions. He says the cost to cities of police protection almost tripled from the 1980s to the 2000s. And local spending on policing adjusted for inflation went from $29 billion in 1972 to $84 billion in 2012. So he makes a lot of good points here. I've linked to his blog, and you can read the entire piece. The link is in the show file here at peterbcollins.com. And an interesting piece, I credit BuzzFeed. I often criticize them for their shallow celebrity listicle-based reporting. But in a lengthy piece, headline, Top Democrats are refusing to defund the police. Activists fear the police killings won't stop. And they single out a guy named Joe Biden and top Democrats who are running away as far as they can from calls to defund and abolish police departments. In reality, they say, Democratic leaders from Biden down have virtually no interest in the call to defund the police. Police reform leaders are as frustrated with Democrats as the president is outraged. They want party leaders to reconsider, worry if they don't, the country will be trapped in another cycle of ineffectual reforms leading to no real changes and more police killings of black people. Grassroots activists and younger Democrats say that they've been disappointed in party leaders, including Biden, Bernie Sanders, black congressional leaders like Jim Clyburn, and Black Caucus Chair Karen Bass, as they've watched them swiftly turn away from those conversations, emphatically rejecting the idea of defunding police because they're afraid of Republicans. And a central interview subject in this article is Charlene Carruthers, an organizer for the Movement for Black Lives and a police reformer from Chicago. She said that black women voters may not turn up for Democrats. She said, we're the ones who show up to vote, and we're calling for investment in our communities. That's a core demand for us. So if they want to remain in those positions of power, it would behoove them to tune into and follow the leadership of the people who show up election after election. Carruthers continued, to me it represents a vast disconnect between what people are seeing in communities across the country and people who have been elected to represent us. The article discusses the various interpretations of what defund means. But as I mentioned, we're seeing city councils across the country make at least initial moves to shift dollars from policing to other parts of the budget that will have more of an impact in reducing crime and keeping communities safe without gun-toting cops on every corner. And speaking of defunding, I want to praise Barbara Lee, Democratic Congresswoman from across the Bay in Oakland. She introduced a resolution yesterday, once again calling for significant cuts to the Pentagon budget. Yes, let's defund the Defense Department. And she didn't put a specific number on it, but I've seen references to as much as 50%. And in a statement, she said, we cannot continue to prioritize funding for a department known for its waste, fraud, abuse, and failure to pass an audit, especially when the money to, quote, protect national security is failing to protect our most vulnerable citizens. Our foreign policy has been militarized to the point that we must repeatedly resort to military solutions for non-military problems. People expect Congress to focus on those threats most likely to harm them, not waste their money on expensive weapons designed for the wars of yesterday, while the most potent threats to Americans struggle to attract funding. Good for you, Barbara. Over at the New York Times today, Nick Kristof, who hails from rural Oregon, heard from some of his contacts there and learned that in the town of Coquille, a logging community of 3,800 people, mostly white, somebody decided to hold a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest. So word spread that 3 busloads of Antifa activists were headed to Coquille to bust up the town. Now, have you ever heard of Antifa people getting on a bus together to go skirmish in the streets? The sheriff and his deputies donned their bulletproof vests, prepared their MRAP armored vehicle, took up positions to fight off the invasion. And then 200 volunteers, many shouldering rifles, gathered to protect their town. In a nearby county, the sheriff warned citizens on Facebook of rumors that the anti-fascists could rampage into his area as well. And he floated, I'm sure we have a lot of local boys, too, with guns that'll protect our citizens. You won't be surprised to know that no anarchists of any kind ever showed up. And you may have heard the story of Bethel, Ohio. It's a suburb of Cincinnati where I grew up. And last weekend, there were some 60 or 80 people who gathered for a little march in support of Black Lives Matter. And 800 counter-protesters, many heavily armed, showed up. When Trump says, maybe tonight's going to be MAGA night, he's hinting that he wants his armed mobs and bullies to take to the streets. And the Trump campaign has been running ads on Facebook, and finally Facebook took some action. In ads, there were some 80 of them that attacked Democrats and linked them to Antifa and far-left mobs. They included a red inverted triangle that was first used by the Nazis to identify communists, social democrats, liberals, Freemasons, and other members of opposition parties. And the badge that was forced on Jewish political prisoners featured a yellow triangle overlaid by a red triangle. So Facebook announced, "We removed these posts and ads for violating our policy against organized hate. Our policy prohibits using a banned hate group symbol to identify political prisoners without the context that condemns or discusses the symbol." So these came in ads paid for by Trump and Pence, Team Trump. It was featured alongside text warning of dangerous capital M, capital O, capital B, capital S mobs of far-left groups, and asking people to sign a petition to support Trump's call to declare Antifa domestic terrorists. So this is an ugly new low, and Facebook has actually done something about it. But these are ads, which are in a different category when it comes to speech than posts by groups or individuals. And it even drew the ire of the Anti-Defamation League CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt. He said it's not difficult for one to criticize their political opponent without using Nazi-era imagery. We implore the Trump campaign to take greater caution and familiarize themselves with the historical context before doing so. Ignorance is not an excuse for appropriating hateful symbols. And Jewish Action, a more progressive group, said this isn't just one post. This is dozens of carefully targeted ads from the official pages of Pence, Trump, and Team Trump, all paid for by Trump and the Republican National Committee, all spreading lies and genocidal imagery. So Trump is continuing with his effort to penalize Twitter and Facebook. It was Twitter, not Facebook, that put a flag on his shooting and looting tweet. And Trump signed that executive order that means absolutely nothing. But the Department of Justice is now following through on that, releasing proposed legislation that would end the liability protection that these sites enjoy under the Communications Decency Act. And they want to basically force these platforms to allow any kind of speech except things that are sexual or crude. The proposal from Bill Barr's Justice Department would rewrite the good faith protections to remove broad discretion about objectionable content and replace it with the mandate to moderate content that is believed to be illegal or promotes violence or terrorism. And, of course, this seems to be the opposite of what Trump really wants, because increasing liability would likely make the platforms more cautious and willing to censor content. And I witnessed that myself this morning. My friend Nancy Walton shared a link to a Facebook post. She didn't write it herself, but it was 4 quadrants. It was comparisons of the number of people shot and killed by police officers in Norway, Finland, Iceland, and the United States. And Facebook had it completely grayed out with a flag that says this is half true. And they don't exactly tell you which half. Then you click on the little link there that is covering the post itself, and it takes you to a page where it reads, "The post comparing U.S. police training and fatal shootings with Nordic countries lacks context." Now, this is so subjective. And there's a page and a half here in 10-point type that gives details that there's minor variations that, in Finland, the cops are trained for more than 2 years, not just the 2 years that the Post says. Then they compare rates of gun ownership. Well, I've never seen a Facebook post that's based on opinion analyzed in such a way. And they claim that their third-party fact-checkers have done this, not the company. I clicked on the information page. How is Facebook addressing false news through third-party fact-checkers? They said that we work with third-party fact-checkers who are certified through the Nonpartisan International Fact-Checking Network to help identify and review false news. And there are 100 questions I have about this, but I'll limit it to one or two. Whose standards are used to describe this as lacking context? And what outcome was interrupted or prevented from just allowing people to read this post and decide for themselves? So this is a really creepy intervention into something that I don't think is so controversial. It's not Russian propaganda, right? Intended to divide and sow discord among Americans. So it's just a slippery slope, and we're sliding pretty fast. One more item about Facebook in the news. This comes from The Intercept and Sam Biddle. A few weeks ago, Facebook made a settlement with the content moderators who have to review some grisly images, depictions of rape, murder, and other gruesome acts, and a lawsuit from 2018 from a former moderator named Selena Scola. She said she developed post-traumatic stress disorder after having to look at that stuff every day. So in early May, Facebook agreed to a $52 million settlement with a $1,000 individual minimum payment to current and former contractors. Now, they don't work directly for Facebook. They work for a firm called Accenture, and they do all kinds of personnel contracting. And Accenture management informed the moderation teams that it had just recently renegotiated its contract with Facebook, and the bottom line is that they were previously required to look at these images for 5.5 hours a day, and now that's being expanded to 6.3 hours a day. What? They just made a settlement with workers about this. And Facebook claims it wasn't their doing. This is just Accenture. But that's hard to take at face value either. As you know, we are operating the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, offering $100 grants to help people who listen to this podcast or are referred by listeners to get through tough times. Today's grant request comes from Chelsea Stokes. She said, during COVID-19, I was let go from my job and I have yet to see any unemployment payments come through. It's been 3 months. I burned through my savings, maintaining bills and groceries. I am humbly asking to be chosen to receive a $100 grant because anything helps to keep food on the table during these scary and uncertain times. Well, Chelsea, no problem. I'll be in touch with you later today and either send you the money over PayPal or mail you a check. Thanks for asking. And if you or someone you know could use $100 to navigate these tough times, don't be shy. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com, or you can use the contact form at the website peterbcollins.com. Here is today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we are confirming now 8.3 million cases, 450,000 deaths. In the U.S., the case count is at 2.1 million, with 118,000 deaths. And a new number, 24 million, almost 25 million, have been tested. And Linda notes that Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center is now offering more contextualized data. they display daily new cases per 100,000 people for each of the states. And this is an important advance in the data presentation, because as we just see these graphs that cases are going upward, well, it's often dismissed by Trump and Pence that, well, we're just testing so much more. But when you put it in the context of new cases per 100,000 population, then you can compare apples to apples, and I'm pleased to see this. Washington State had some data management issues. They are now reporting, they have been reporting incorrect testing numbers for 8 weeks by overcounting the number of people who have tested negative. The state dashboard has shown 13% more people testing negative since April 21st than the actual data show. The BBC is trying to get a handle on the deaths attributed to coronavirus, and they report that at least another 130,000 people worldwide have died during the pandemic, on top of the 440,000 officially recorded deaths. A review of preliminary mortality data from 27 countries shows that in many places the number of overall deaths has been even higher than normal, even when accounting for the virus. These so-called excess deaths, the number of deaths above the average, suggest the human impact of the pandemic far exceeds the official figures. Linda also tells us that according to Axios, 5 states with the smallest increases in unemployment were among the top 7 recipients of the Paycheck Protection Program. The top 5 states with unemployment rates ranked 41 to 50th in the receiving of PPP assistance. And additional research shows that 41% of black business owners have shut their doors since the pandemic started. We don't know how many of them will be able to reopen those doors, but according to Axios, 95% of black-owned businesses were cut out of the PPP program. So it's going to be a big shindig in Tulsa this weekend with Saturday's pro-Trump mob rally. It's being now tagged as the Great American Comeback. And to sign up for the rally, attendees must accept a warning and agree to relieve the campaign of any liability for illness or injury. Meanwhile, officials in Oklahoma are not happy about this. Health Commissioner Lance Fry said that attendees should still be tested for the virus after the campaign event. They are going to hand out face masks. They're going to do temperature checks, but they're not requiring people to wear those masks. And we'll have to scan the crowd photos to see how many of them actually wear them. And the caseload numbers continue to grow. Arizona has 2,500 new cases as of today. Florida, 3,200. California, 4,000. More than half of those in the Los Angeles area. And Trump is saying that, these figures are inconvenient. We're testing too much. Testing is overrated, he said. He just wants lower numbers. He doesn't care what they actually mean. And also that we're learning that public health leaders from across the country are bearing the brunt of public anger about the shutdowns, about the mask rules, and at least 27 state or local public health leaders across 13 states have resigned, retired, or been fired since April. We have a loyal listener, Jason Ferguson, who is currently living in South Korea, and he sent 2 emails in the last day or so. Listening to yesterday's podcast, he said, and he tags himself as a libertarian, I really liked your personal responsibility free market idea for the police to carry liability insurance. I hope that idea catches on and is discussed further. Well, I'll do my best, Jason. Jason also sent along an article describing the impact on people who are sickened by the coronavirus in South Korea. Treatment can cost as much as $11,000 if you have severe symptoms. But medical fees have not been a burden for Koreans because the national health insurance covers 80% of the cost, and the central government covers the rest. That would be universal, single-payer health care. We can't have that here. One patient said, I had to quit my job after getting infected, so it was stressful, but I didn't need to worry about the direct financial costs. I was able to focus on getting treated, and I think that's why I was able to recover quickly. Coronavirus has sent a bunch of cruise ships up on the rocks. One of the biggest cruise ship companies, which of course enjoys a lot of American customers and benefits. They got bailouts from the U.S. government, even though they're based offshore, and their ships are flagged for convenience in very lenient countries. But Carnival suffered losses of over $4 billion in the past 3 months. Revenues dropped sharply. But Carnival thinks that some of its loyalists will get back on the ship starting later this summer. They have $475 million banked in bookings for 2020 sailings. Who's on a cruise ship these days? Well, they're selling 6 of their megaships to try to generate cash. And I'm a sailor, but I hate those cruise ships. I have taken one cruise once, and when I get really old, I might do it once again, but I didn't enjoy it. It's all about the buffet, and you're trapped on board with people you mostly don't know. Anyway, I'm not in the market for a cruise ship. I'll just take myself out of consideration for that. Now to the reaction to John Bolton's book. The Justice Department is piling on more legal maneuvers, asking a judge for an emergency restraining order to block the delivery of the books that have already been printed and shipped to stores all over the country. Simon & Schuster is the publisher of Bolton's book, also married to, forgive me if this is too much information. President's niece, in her book, reports that Donald Trump has lost control of his bowels. Now, I don't have all the details, and frankly, I don't want them, but I guess that means he's got to wear diapers now. And if the public, well, I guess we know about it now, but that's got to be one of those things that Trump really doesn't want us to know. So they're claiming that disclosure of the manuscript will damage the national security of the United States. Trump has taken the position that every one of his conversations with John Bolton was top secret, and no court is going to support that claim. So we get reviews on this new book. Scott Ritter got a chance to read it. Over at RT, he publishes his comments. He says, Bolton's criticism is little more than a screed, a collection of backroom gossip that, while appearing inflammatory and alarming, with carefully couched qualifiers, and has not been corroborated by people who were in the same room as Bolton when claims happened, went down. Indeed, regarding some of Bolton's most explosive allegations about interactions between Trump's President Xi, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer for those meetings told a Senate hearing that no such conversation took place. Later, Ritter says, like any leak involving sensitive, most likely classified information, its publication is challenged by the administration. Trump's detractors are noting that the legal challenges only add credence to the legitimacy of his claims. Then there's a piece by Susan B. Glasser at the New Yorker today. She thinks it has a little more value than Ritter does. But she writes, this is Washington's score settling on an epic scale. Mnuchin, the secretary, had no idea what he was talking about. Nikki Haley, ambassador to the UN, described by Bolton as a self-promoting Paul who sucked up to Trump's family. General Mattis, the former defense secretary, described as a bureaucratic obstructionist who deluded himself into thinking that an axis of adults could manage the unmanageable. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, who would emerge as the great internal enemy during Bolton's 17-month tenure, is an untruthful hypocrite who flatters Trump to his face while dumping on him privately. Bolton quotes Pompeo, describing Trump at the meeting with Kim Jong-un. He, Trump, is so full of shit. Later she writes, the ultimate score settling in the book is not with Pompeo or Mnuchin, it's with Donald Trump, a man so corrupt and profoundly unsuited for the presidency that his own national security advisor, a lifelong Republican with unimpeachable partisan credentials, came to believe he adopted obstruction of justice as a way of life. And she continues, Bolton's book, in fact, is a scathing and revelatory account of Trump's stunning ignorance, incompetence, and corruption, and it should be taken seriously for what it is, the harshest on-the-record indictment yet of Trump by a former subordinate. One of the things that you probably know that was reported yesterday on this podcast is that Bolton claims that Trump told Xi that it was fine with Trump for the way China is treating the Uyghur minority Muslims in far west Xinjiang province, with reported re-education camps holding as many as 1 million people. Well, today, Trump showed that he can pivot. He signed a measure to potentially sanction Chinese officials for interning ethnic Uyghurs in China. It's called the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, passed unanimously by both houses of Congress. It drew a furious response from Beijing today during a delicate moment when Secretary of State Pompeo was meeting in Hawaii with Communist Party Foreign Policy Director Yang Jiechi. And I don't think that this measure has any teeth. It is more of a resolution than a law. But Trump signed it without a ceremony today and took the opportunity to say that John Bolton is a liar. Well, takes one to know one. It's really hard to choose sides between Bolton and Trump when they're squabbling this way. Finally today, you know what an ag-gag is? These are unconstitutional measures passed at the state level to penalize people who expose wrongdoing on farms, including factory farms. Some of the exposure comes from animal rights activists, other from people who are more focused on the environmental damage. So Iowa has been attempting to pass one, and this is the third attempt. They tucked it into a bill related to COVID-19. And there are more than 24 states that have these ag-gag laws. So last Friday, Iowa passed a bill to increase penalties for animal rights activism that's targeted the factory farming industry. Brief debates were followed rapidly by votes in favor of the legislation. It awaits the governor's signature. The latest bill would create a new crime, food operation trespass, for anyone who enters a location without permission, where a food animal is kept, or where meat is sold or processed. A first-time trespasser would face up to 2 years of incarceration, a fine of $6,000 plus. The penalties escalate from there. But as Kevin Gostola reports today at Shadowproof, a similar piece of legislation, the ag-gag law in North Carolina, has been declared largely unconstitutional by a federal court. Judge Thomas Schroeder concluded that North Carolina's Property Protection Act violated the First Amendment, he removed multiple provisions from the law. It is the fifth state to have their ag-gag law struck down by a federal court. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. A little lower, please. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.